This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, we're talking about Giles Goat-Boy by John Barth, one of the lesser-known novels on Burgess's list, but it's an experimental and chaotic delight and well worth a closer look. In Giles Goat-Boy, the world is reinvented as a huge global university, with mankind being the students and God being the founder. In the rural fields at the edge of the university, George Giles, a young man of indeterminate birth, is being reared among a herd of goats by a mysterious ex-professor who suspects him of being the grand tutor, or messiah, for which the world is waiting. The only problem is, George believes he's a goat and not a student. The story concerns George's heroic adventure to transcend his goatish origins and complete a series of tasks so he can become a grand tutor. Along the way, he meets his mother, his mysterious father, and the love of his life. But through George's goat-like eyes, the world looks absurd, and those in power look insane. The novel is a patchwork of satirical allegories. Most obviously, the New Testament, as shown in the subtitle of the book, The Revised New Syllabus, and George, the eponymous goat boy suspected of being the product of Immaculate Conception. The novel can also be seen as a Cold War allegory, with the East Campus of the global university in a fruitless conflict with the West Campus. The novel also reckons with the idea of classical heroes such as Odysseus, Hercules, and even Jesus Christ, and playfully deconstructs elements of these familiar stories. The complexity of the novel is further emphasised by a framing narrative, which claims the text was written by a computer and assembled and edited by John Barth, a radical idea when the novel was first published in 1966. John Barth is perhaps most famous for his book of short stories, Lost in the Funhouse, which remains an early articulation of many of the aspects that would come to be known as postmodern. He began his career writing realist novels in The Floating Opera and The End of the Road, both published in the late 1950s. In 1960, the course of his career changed when he published The Sotweed Factor, a vast postmodern historical novel about the early colonies of America, told in imitation 17th century prose and concerning the picaresque adventures of the real-life poet Ebenezer Cook. His fiction grapples with classical myth and literary tradition, examining the way familiar stories are used to create fictional worlds. To help us understand Giles Goat-Boy, we invited the novelist and critic David Morrell onto the podcast. David studied the fiction of John Barth for his PhD thesis and published a book, John Barth, An Introduction, which remains one of the best studies of Barth's early fiction. He is better known for his creation of John Rambo in his novel First Blood, which was later adapted into a film starring Sylvester Stallone in the title role. More recently, he has written a series of crime novels featuring the famed opium eater Thomas de Quincey. This trilogy, beginning with Murder as a Fine Art, is available now from Mulholland Books. John Barth, An Introduction, is currently available as an ebook. To find out more, check out the links in the description of this episode. You can also head to the description to find a list of all the books discussed in this episode. I'm Graham Foster of the Burgess Foundation, and I spoke to David Morrell in October 2021. We begin our conversation with David's memories of meeting Burgess at the University of Iowa in 1975. David, thanks for joining us on the 99 Novels podcast. We're going to be talking about John Barth's Giles Goat-Boy, which was one of Burgess's choices for his list of 99 novels. But first, you actually knew Burgess, didn't you?
I did, and also John Barth is still alive, so I don't want to be in the past tense, but I know John Barth as well. So there's a interesting connection here. In 1975, I was an associate professor at the University of Iowa in the English department. I'm an author as well as a teacher, and sometimes people figure, oh well, David was at the writers' workshop at the University of Iowa, a very famous part of the university. But in fact, I was in the English department. I taught the American novel and other elements of American literature. And that year, 75, Anthony Burgess came to the University of Iowa because of an arrangement he had with the university's music department. He had taught at other institutions, but the University of Iowa, and, it's known for having its writers, and was very excited to have it. And I didn't know for sure why this happened, but logic tells us that he went there because the music department was going to debut the symphony. And what the heck, we might as well have Anthony teaching in the English department. So the way this worked is that his office was next to mine. And we have to remember this. I was a professor. I had published two novels, one of First Blood and another book called Testament. And I'm just starting my authorial career. And here we have what, for me, for most people, was a legend. And by God, he left his office door open. And then one day I thought, well, I should go in and say hello, bearing in mind that the huge admiration I had for him, and I had a copy of A Clockwork Orange, which anybody interested in the modern novel has to know that novel. So I thought, well, I'll ask him if he would autograph it for me, and so he did, and he was very generous in his autograph. Very collegial, greeting me. The general tone was one author to another, and things like that, which really made me feel good. And I thought, well, I'll give him a copy of First Blood. And it's amusing to me now because I gather he kept all his books. So he kept that copy of First Blood, and it shows I left out a word. I didn't want to gush with praise, and even though that's what I wanted to do. And what I said was, here's a book in memory of your stay at Iowa. And I left a word out. I was so nervous. That I left a word out, and so it gives you a sense of the reality of it. So we traded. Well, we didn't exactly trade books, but in any case, he had, and we talked. I cannot recall that we talked about anything major. I found him to be very gracious, very friendly, very. I, one writer to another, and here we are. Let's have a chat. And when I went back and forth in later days, I'd say hello. And so it wasn't a major friendship, but it is one of those moments where you say that was a high point in my life. And there's a side story uh, that makes me smile involving Burt Lancaster. Because Burt had been in a TV miniseries called Moses the Lawgiver, which memory serves was 1974, year before Anthony came to University of Iowa. And Burt Lancaster came to Iowa City, where the University of Iowa is. Well, I mean, let us imagine this. This is one of the major movie stars, not only of his time, but of all time, coming to Iowa City to confer with Anthony about, this is the story I received, about a possible other miniseries. And the story went around that Anthony had rented a house I have to laugh even as I think about it. And imagine the housekeeper. So she's vacuuming the floor, the living room, and there's a knock on the door. And she goes over to open the door, and there she is looking at, and she's sure she's insane, Burt Lancaster. And she says, and he asks, is Anthony home? And no, he isn't. And, all right, well, I'll try to contact him other ways. And I just think that's a hilarious story. And Burt generously agreed to give a workshop for the University of Iowa drama department. And I had a friend who was in the drama department who contacted me and said, hey, if you in an hour, if you have the time, get over here because Burt Lancaster is going to do a workshop. And in any case, one other a quick story about University of Iowa um, and Giles Goat-Boy, which is a form of a Giles Goat-Boy is both considered metafiction and also something called fabulation. And it turns out that a major book about fabulation called The Fabulists was written by a man named Robert Scholes. And Robert Scholes wrote that book while he was at the University of Iowa. And he had then moved to Brown University. And his office, his old office, was my office. So here I was in Robert Scholes's former office next door to Anthony Burgess. And here we are talking about a book of metafiction and fabulation, which basically started in many ways with John Barth.
Well, that's a fascinating story, and I think you've provided a really good link to get into talking about John Barth and Giles Goat-Boy. How did you first discover the novel, and what did you first make of it?
Well, I'm Canadian by birth. I was born and raised in Canada in southern Ontario, near Toronto, and I had gone to the Penn State University because I was very impressed by the scholarly work of a Hemingway a professor named Philip Young. And people listening, professors do have influence. I mean, I was newly married. We had a new baby, and my wife and I and our very small child immigrated to the United States to go to Penn State to be with Philip Young. Well, John Barth had taught at Penn State. There's these interesting, and not exactly coincidences, but the way things tie together. And Jack, as he likes to be called, had come to Penn State in the mid 50s and um, had gone from writing two realistic novels, The Floating Opera and The End of the Road, to The Sotweed Factor and then Giles Goat-Boy, which were the reverse, in which he was basically turning his back on realism and exploring other ways to write fiction. And his best friend, John Barth's best friend at Penn State, was Philip Young. So Philip and I would talk about Barth, and as it turned out, in 1966, the year I arrived at Penn State, that was the year Giles Goat-Boy was published, and it made a great stir at Penn State. And people wished he were still there so that they could bask in the attention the book was getting, but also um, John Barth was suddenly a New York Times bestseller, and nobody could figure it out because Giles Goat-Boy is very long, over 700 pages, and is not exactly the sort of book that one expects on a bestseller list. So there was a lot of talk about it, and a few years later, I said I was at the point where I needed to choose a topic for my dissertation. And Philip Young had written about Hemingway, two books of which I note are on Anthony's list. And he had written about Hemingway when Hemingway was still alive. And we were talking about what would be a good topic, and he said, "Well, why don't you write about Jack?" In a way, it's similar to me writing about Hemingway, that he's still alive, and there is an immediacy to the reactions to the books that's still available, unlike writing about authors who are deceased. And the more I thought about it, the more interesting it became. Jack had studied at the Juilliard School of Music to be a drummer and an orchestrator before he went on to be an author. And I continue to think that knowledge of music, especially how music is constructed, and Anthony's a good example, is very helpful in structuring novels. In any case, Philip Young had a piano in his basement, and he decided to have a jam session with the various professors in the English department. One was a trombonist, a man named Robert Frank, who was a medievalist. And Jack was going to play the drums, and Philip invited various people, and there were cocktails, and there was some jazz. It was a really a memorable afternoon, and Philip went to Jack and said, "I want you to meet a student of mine," and I think maybe they'd had some words about it sooner than earlier. In any case, Jack came over, and I had a chance to talk to him for about 15 or 20 minutes. And I explained that I wanted to write a dissertation about his work that would be very different, that would, in effect, be the story of how the novels were written. And that it would rely a lot on his interviews, both in print and also if he would be so kind as to allow me to interview him often in person. And he said, sure. And in fact, he gave me permission to go to his archive at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And the security there was very strict, but I had the written documentation and they let me in. And I spent a very exciting day there with his archives and notes that he'd made for his novels and things like that. So with his guidance, I was able to write a dissertation that was very, very different, the story behind the stories. And while we can't always trust an author to know what the value of a work is that author has written, sometimes things happen magically. But often, as with John Barth, the degree of deliberation with which he wrote his books was something that was worth recreating on the page.
Great, and the picture you've painted there is of Giles Goat-Boy being a huge phenomenon, which even though I'm a massive John Barth fan, it strikes me as quite odd because it is an extremely difficult book in many ways. Why do you think Burgess selected Giles Goat-Boy for his 99 novels over, say, something like The Sotweed Factor, which is much, much more fun? It's a romp, The Sotweed Factor. It's a sort of high comedy, whereas Giles Goat-Boy is something a lot more complicated. Why do you think Burgess chose it?
As I think about the body of John Barth's work and the relationship it has to one another, the titles, the Sotweed Factor seems to me more representative of what Anthony's talking about in his introduction to the 99 titles. But he wrote, what is it, 1982 that he wrote the notes for this?
At 1984, he wrote
Okay,
the book. Yeah,
but close enough. And metafiction, and we'll no doubt wind up talking about this. Metafiction or fabulation or postmodernism, as the books are sometimes called, um, was very, to use a very unscholarly term, hot in the 60s and the 70s. By 85, it was starting to dwindle, interest in it. And these days, it seems like it's very seldom, except for what we're doing, it's very seldom you hear anybody talk about it. The sense I get from what he said about the book is that he admired its bigness, he admired its scope, its expansiveness, not only in terms of plot, but also in terms of the multiple techniques that Barth was using. And that, as he says, that book went against current trends. If you think about um, much of what was being published then and now, it's a very uncharacteristic a book for certainly for the bestseller list. And I think he was just overwhelmed a by its intelligence and its multi techniques and its ambition and size. And I mean, it's hard to ignore it. Or the Saltweed Factor, we can go in. And for people who might not know about the Saltweed Factor, it's an imitation 1700s novel, and done brilliantly, about a real man named Ebenezer Cook, about whom not a whole lot was known, so that he could use a lot of the written, Barth could use a lot of the written, what we know historically, and then amplify it. And I think, um, uh, as you and I agree, probably the Saltweed Factor would have been better. My favorite Barth is something called Lost in the Funhouse, which the short story in that, which is a short story about writing a short story, is something that I've referred to again and again in my own work and in my teaching. It's if our listeners aren't aware of it, it's the book Lost in the Funhouse, and then within it is the short story, and the funhouse is fiction, which is a kind of surrogate for life.
You mentioned Lost in the Funhouse, and that book I think is particularly important in Barth's career, but sort of combining that with Giles Goat-Boy has meant that Barth has often been called one of the first pioneers of postmodern fiction.
Yes.
Do you think that's a fair categorization? And does Barth himself agree with that, or does he resist it in any way?
Well, he tended not to put himself in relationship with other writers, except people like Borges. He certainly felt was an influence, and it occurs to me that for people not familiar with Giles Goat-Boy, it was written at Penn State, and in a way, it's about Penn State using Penn State and its various elements, various campus elements, and the fact that Penn State began as an agricultural college. So he has goat barns in the novel, and basically uses the university as an allegory for the condition of the world in 1966. Now, as Anthony notes in his commentary about the novel, in fact, I have it here. Um, uh, he says the book is allegory, parody, didactic treatise, fable, religious codex, and the taking of it seriously entails the taking of it unseriously, which is to say that it's a comedy. Um, and he talks about the allegory being quite accessible. I mean, it's very obvious, and various real life people appear in disguised forms, such as President Eisenhower, whose brother Milton Eisenhower was the president of Penn State at the time that Jack was writing Giles Goat-Boy. So the one theory about the reason that Giles Goat-Boy became a success, that is a bestseller, a financial success, is that people read it thinking it was a roman à clèves, that they were going to see. It's almost like a Harold Robbins novel, and Anthony talks about elsewhere. He talks about Harold Robbins, and not very kindly. But some of these books, it's like The Godfather, and you know the singer in there is Frank Sinatra, so that you think you have some insider knowledge. And so one theory is that people were reading the book to see what real life people were embedded with other names in this allegory. So we have East Campus and West Campus, and we have a computer, which in 1966 is pretty amazing. And the computer is like the hydrogen bomb. And some of it, in retrospect, um, feels like a stretch. Like, okay, we get it. But what distinguished the book was that Philip Young, having read The Saltweed Factor, pointed out to John Barth that elements of the story matched what Lord Raglan had said in The Hero and Joseph Campbell had said in his books about mythic heroes. And that and Jack got very excited, and he went off to the library, which is almost exactly as it is described in Giles Goat-Boy. And he took these books and read them and began making notes about the ideal hero's journey. And he had 22 stages, much of which he took from Lord Raglan. And Philip Young was known at the time for not only being a Hemingway scholar, but also for having pioneered something which we could call mythic criticism, in which um, certain stories, such as Rip Van Winkle, the Rip Van Winkle story by Washington Irving, can be investigated as including archetypes and other kinds of mythic ingredients that we could then move over to Freud and Jung and what have you. I found it a very exciting way to look at some books. And so what John Barth did was consciously structure the book along the 22 stages of the mythic hero's journey. And I, going through his notes, found a chart that he had made, a circular chart in which he showed, from birth through the heroes from birth, from mysterious origins, usually often from a virgin, and on through the 33 the things, the crisis that happens at 33 years of age, and what happens afterwards. And the Christ story is one good example, if we approach the biblical story from a mythic point of view. And anyhow, so what Barth was doing was something that had never really been done before. That here we have a scholar commenting on what subconsciously authors had been doing, and now we have an author consciously using elements in Raglan and Campbell to look at it from a different point of view. And I might add that Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces was a huge influence on my First Blood novel. I used various stages of the mythic heroes, particularly Campbell's separation, initiation, and return structure. That we're born, we have a home life, and then we leave home. We go out in the middle of our lives in an initiation, and then we return home to discover that everything is not what we imagined it when we were young. And in First Blood, we have elements in the town with Rambo breaking out of jail, going up into the mountains where he has a mystical experience in a bat cave, and then coming back to town for the third act, a totally changed person. So it's funny how these ideas, especially at an institution like Penn State, can fertilize back and forth.
It seems to me that each of his novels is an attempt to reprocess myth or classical literature, the sort of stories that like A Thousand and One Nights and those sorts of things, it's an attempt to sort of reprocess them, and literary criticism to a certain extent, as you've been saying, in a way that creates a new story. Is that a fair thing to say?
Oh, absolutely. We have here a mind that expands. The books, reading John Barth chronologically, it's amazing to see how his mind expands in terms of how to write fiction. He once said in an interview, and I talk to when I teach writing occasionally, and I mention this to students that you have two choices. And these are John Barth's options. You can either be a Windex writer, and I don't know if Windex is a brand in the UK. It's what Americans use to clean windows. And so, the Windex is that you're never aware that you're reading a novel or a short story, that the technique is transparent, that it invites you to immerse yourself in the story. And even when you're turning the pages, somehow you're doing it subconsciously and not being aware that there's a book in your hand, so that if you're interrupted, it's like you're coming out of a trance. So that's one choice, to be a Windex writer, or you can be, as Barth said, you can be a stained glass writer, in which the stained glass colors what's beyond it and in fact becomes the whole point. So it's either an invisible window or else it's a self-conscious window. In his two early books, The Floating Opera and The End of the Road, one is a comic realistic fatalistic novel, and the other one is it's very depressing. As the title suggests, The End of the Road. And having written these two slightly different realistic novels, he had this epiphany that he was going to write something. He'd heard about Ebenezer Cook in late 1600s Maryland, which is near where basically Jack was raised, in Maryland and the Tidewater area. And so he thought that might be interesting to write a book about a imitation. You can see how his mind goes. All right, I'll write about this guy from the late 1600s, but wait a minute, does that make sense to write a modern novel that what feels like a modern novel about a 1600s character, or do I want to write a imitation novel that's sort of from the period, about that period? And now immediately you're on a second level, and I find it very exciting. As you know, I wrote three books. Our Manchester connection. Thomas de Quincey, the opium eater, was born in Manchester and went to the Manchester Grammar School, a version of the buildings of which still exist. When I decided to write a series of mystery thrillers about de Quincey, the choice again, this is the Barth influence. I said, well, I could write it, as if it's right now, but with all the historical, all the ideas we have now, Freud, for example, and Einstein, as two examples, which makes all kinds of anachronisms in the text. Or I could pretend that I'm writing an 1854 novel in the manner of, say, Charles Dickens, or my favorite of the period, Mary Elizabeth Braddon. And so, and this is Barth's influence on me, but he's going at it like as if it never been done before. I'm sure we could find a few examples, and it's very exciting for him to write this imitation novel, which is not realistic and yet in parts feels that way. And then he goes one step further with Giles Goat-Boy. There's a moment in Giles Goat-Boy which defines Barth's later work. Giles is in the library racing away from some people who are desperate to get him. And so it's a kind of a thriller moment. And we know that Jack is, imitating a thriller at that point. And he's lost in the library, which I have to laugh is like Lost in the Funhouse. And he sees a reference library ahead of him, librarian, and rushes up to her because he wants to know how the heck to get out of this place. So he runs up to her and now I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the quote, and says, "How do I get out of her here?" I asked. And I heard her say, "How do I get out of her here?" And she looked up at me from the book she was reading as if I was exactly the person she expected to see at that moment. So what we have is a librarian reading Giles Goat-Boy, the novel that we are reading, and that I mean, the layers of reality or non-reality, I find that moment chilling in the way that it adds so many depths. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
Actually, in all of Barth's work, there are moments like this. I mean, listening to you talk about that, it reminded me of Tidewater Tales, in which the main characters sort of find the story floating in the the
Yes,
river that they're sailing on, essentially. And I think that's really important. But one thing that I think, talking about Barth in this way, as a sort of self-referential author, an author that is sort of playing scholarly games within his fiction, that sort of avoids what some of the things that I find in his fiction, especially Giles Goat-Boy and the Sotweed Factor, is that the novels are very, very human. There are moments of sort of pure human experience. I wonder if you could say anything about that.
that was one of his goals. He talked about fire and ice. There's an essay he wrote on the subject. I think it was for the Washington Post Book World, which is no longer with us, and about that he brings to his work a degree of preparation and deliberation. To hear, I heard him give talks in a formal circumstance in auditoriums, I believe 3 times, and to hear him talk about the way he puts fictions together. That there was I can't recall what work he was talking about, but that he had 3 climaxes in the novel, that he'd set up the narrative so that the climax of one plot point would enable the climax of the next plot point, and would then enable the climax of yet another plot point. And he linked these to multiple orgasms.
Right.
And that story is very typical of the humor, and the for such a intellectual writer, so in a way down to earth. And his goal, he said, it's very interesting, of course, to have the technical proficiency to be able, and remember, he was a musician, wanting to be an orchestrator, the structure, that to have that technical proficiency. But he said, if that's all you have, what's the point? And that's so you have the ice of the narrative deliberation, and that he would mingle it with the passion, the fire that he hoped he brought to his to the characters, and often the characters were stories themselves. So we know in Lost in the Funhouse, he has a couple of stories in which the stories narrate their own life story, about how they were born in someone's mind and how they originated, and one case didn't turn out too well. And in some ways, when I teach writing, and in my writing book, I have a writing book, and I point out that in some ways, all you need to do is read the short story "Lost in the Funhouse," and you know everything there is in a way, but the basics. There's a he talks about what he calls fill in the blanks writing. He had hair that looked like dot dot dot, and the narrator says, "Well, what are our choices here? What does his hair look like?" Or I forget if it was his hair, but and he says, "So this basically is fill in the blank writing. It really doesn't matter what you put there, but you've got to put something." And you sense that this is the problem that he had with realism, that it had so many fill in the blank moments that were required. A character walks in a room, must be described. Well, if you do that long enough, it gets to be pretty tedious. And what John Barth had found was a way around this.
You've talked so brilliantly about Giles Goat-Boy and Barth's work, but what do you think the legacy of Giles Goat-Boy is, and do you see the influence of Barth in any authors working today?
I don't. The the world changed. There were other writers working in this. We mentioned Pynchon and John Fowles, and Samuel Beckett, Nabokov, William Gaddis. I just made a list. William S. Burroughs, who, if I'm not mistaken, was a friend of Anthony's. Is that correct?
They met.
Burroughs.
They met a few times. Yeah.
Okay. And Kurt Vonnegut and Donald Barthelme and Thomas Pynchon, as we said. It was a very hot. I remember when, for a time, that's all the kinds of books that were being reviewed were metafiction, fabulation, postmodernism. And then, as happens, things get not so current. And I dare say that he now is somewhat of a footnote. I hate to say it, that I don't see the influence except, and forgive me, John Barth influences all through my own work. Now I write popular fiction that tries to be more than that. I'm trying to suck readers into the narrative, and then I have devious undertones that I'm trying to communicate. And often it is in the form of the kind of metafiction that John Barth was known for. And I have dedicated a few books to John Barth, and I talk about him whenever I talk about writing. And going back to what I said earlier, are you a Windex writer or are you a stained glass writer? Your choices stem from that. But at the moment, as sad as it makes me seem, and it makes me feel, although I'm sure we're going to get people saying, "Why, you fool, look at the influence here and look at the influence there." But at least from my perspective, I'm not seeing it. It may have been so absorbed. I can't imagine that Quentin Tarantino, whose references are filmic, would have known Barth's work. But boy, he sure makes films that are in Barth's tradition.
I think that's interesting. I think the work of Barth and the work of the postmodernists of the 1960s and 70s in general has been, to some extent, been absorbed into the mainstream and it's sort of filtered out. But the author that I think of when I think of John Barth is David Foster Wallace, who wrote a story called "Westward: The Course of Empire Takes Its Way," and it's a sort of, he describes it as his patricide short story, and it's a way of, uh, in his own words, killing off the influence of Barth. And I
Mm.
I think that sort of Barth's rough treatment, in a way, by David Foster Wallace has sort of convinced a lot of people that Barth wasn't as important as he was, and I think that's a real shame. And I think Wallace is wrong. I think Barth is a tremendously important writer, and I think I wish people would read him more. Really.
Well, certainly he is among the most major authors of the 60s and 70s, and the number of awards he received, it testified. I mean, prestigious awards, National Book Awards, like that, testifies to the influence. But as we know, things change, and especially in our culture today, where I mean, it's almost like years transition. The things just happen so fast and seem to be, negating and erasing where we came from. But you put it very very well. He became authors had to be aware of him. To change the metaphor a little, there's a film, The Wild Bunch, a 1969 film by Sam Peckinpah, and it's the film that had the most influence on me. And again, it affected my later work. And in movies, especially in westerns, that is 1969 with the Wild Bunch is a watershed year. Thereafter, westerns had to make a choice to either do revisionistic westerns or else go back deliberately and imitate the earlier classic forms of the western. And this goes back to Windex and stained glass. That for a time, that was a choice that authors had to make because it's hard to exaggerate how much this was a topic in book reviews and in essays in prestigious magazines, not scholarly magazines, but like the Atlantic and things like that. In fact, it was the Atlantic, I believe, that published Lost in the Funhouse. So what you said that this debate got absorbed, and then as you put it, filtered out. I think there are still writers who are that are still following Barth's example, even if they are not perhaps being as self-conscious about the way they might write the book. I get very excited when I think of Barth because he had so expanding what the idea of what fiction could be. He said, reality's a nice place to live, but you wouldn't want to stay there very long. And neither did fiction.
I think that's a brilliant summation of what makes Barth not only important but really enjoyable to read. Um, just one final question. Burgess chose 99 novels for his list. If you could select a 100th novel, what would it be and why?
I will go in a totally different direction. The people ask me about the novels that changed my life as an author, and they would, I suspect, be of the sort that Anthony was talking about as popular works that perhaps didn't transcend. Um, there's a British author named Geoffrey Household who wrote a novel called Rogue, Rogue, Rogue Male, Male. And it's about a British big game hunter who, on the eve of the Second World War, sets out to stalk Hitler and goes into Europe from the UK and he gets caught on the first page. And it's not about the stalking, it's about his escape. Household wrote the book in 1939, about 1939. And when I was trying to be a writer, learning to be a writer, and I was writing very bad academic novels. And a professional writer I had met at Penn State, whose name was Philip Klass, his pen name, he was a science fiction writer, William Tenn. He said, based upon a draft of a story that I'd let him see, that he'd agreed to see, he said, "You've been reading Geoffrey Household." And I said, "I don't know who he is." And he lent me a copy of Rogue Male, and I read it, and I came back to him and I said, "You mean you're allowed to write this way?" And that changed my life so that I would have to put that novel um, more than anything. I was gratified that there was a film made of it with Peter O'Toole that the British Film Institute recently remastered.
Is there anything that you've got coming up that you want to tell us about?
As I'm working on a Western. It's taking me a very long time because there are so many cliches in Westerns. But the cliches have a reason for existing because they tap into certain elements of excitement. And so what I'm trying to do is find another way to write a Western that still satisfies us as a Western, but at the same time makes it seem as if a Western had never been written. And oh boy, is that hard. And some days I'm in my third year, which is not something I'm used to. First Blood took me 3 years, my first novel, and I'm not used to that kind of length. But I'm just doggedly determined, and once again, I think the reason I'm persisting is again that Barthian influence. That what can you do to take a genre inside out and yet still provide the excitement that the genre gave in the first place? So that's what I'm doing, and Lord knows when it'll be finished.
David, thank you for joining us. It's been a fascinating insight into Barth and your connections with Barth, with Burgess, with literature in general. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it was a thrill to talk about these things.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. To join the conversation and suggest your own 100th book for Burgess's list, you can use the hashtag 99novels on Twitter. David Morrell's latest novel is Ruler of the Night, the third volume in his series about Thomas de Quincey. It is available now. You can find out more about David at his website, davidmorrell.net. For more about Anthony Burgess and to find out how you can support the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit www.anthonyburgess.org. The theme music is Anthony Burgess's Concerto for Flute, Strings and Piano in D minor. It is performed by No Dice Collective, who can be found online at nodicecollective.com. If you have enjoyed this episode, why not leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts?